Welcome to Coffee and Compete, the show about the news, gossip, and tactics of competitive business strategy. I'm Adam McQueen, and today we have a very, very, very special guest. We have Andre Csapo, a research director at Klue. Andre, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I am very excited for this one too. Can you quickly share with the listeners what is a research director like? What does your role entail, and how is that related to win-loss?
A research director at Klue is responsible for doing the design of the research. So anything that touches research is our responsibility. So first off, we help the clients figure out what exactly is it that they're trying to uncover with the research. Then we design the research survey and guides. And then we execute the actual interviews by conducting them ourselves. And then afterwards, we do the analysis of all the different key findings to meet back to the research objectives that they had lined out at the beginning of the project.
This is kind of a fun episode too, because we've interviewed different program owners with win-loss, and a lot of them actually work with you too. Some of our customers that were speaking glowingly of you, the people that are running the program. So it's cool to get kind of the Klue side of the story here too, about how the sausage is made. We are talking about all things related to conducting a win-loss interview, since this is your wheelhouse. First up, tell me about your most memorable interview moment. This could be funny, it could be unique. Like, what's the most memorable interview moment you've had in your career?
There's been a lot of memorable moments. The ones that are more exciting for the clients is when we have a new insight, something you haven't heard before. I'll get on a Slack message and tell the client right away, because it breaks open our understanding of the research problem that we're looking at. But also lately I've been, Klue likes to drink their own champagne, and we do our own win-loss interviews. And lately I've had to listen to a lot of what I think is a little fawning compliments of the Klue sellers as they go on and praise our sellers and how wonderful they are. And then I have to endure several minutes of that during the interview, and then know that this will be documented and shared across the organization. As we all know, sellers are the last people that need that kind of encouragement.
This is a good test too, to make sure any of our sales reps tuning into this episode, I want to know which of these folks are getting this kind of praise right now, and that they have listened to the podcast too here. So how has your perspective changed from the first time you were running buyer interviews to today, in terms of what makes a good win-loss interview?
I think what I've learned over time is that a great interviewee, a great respondent, is a really big help. I'm always impressed with some of the people we speak with. They're very articulate. They are able to summarize their understanding of their evaluation really clearly and succinctly. That makes my job a lot easier. For someone who likes to speak in circles, it's much harder, or they don't get to the point. We have limited time, and it takes up precious time, so we can't cover as much terrain. So on the one hand, I'd say a great respondent is important. And as in terms of interviewer, what I think I've learned is to carefully craft very clear and short questions, which aren't too leading, but sets them up to tell a story. Because when they tell a story, it's a little bit more interesting, and you get a little bit more detail, and they feel a little bit more comfortable. So they're not just answering short yes or no questions.
Could you share an example with that? Like, what does that look like in terms of what's a bad question for a listener that's thinking through? There'll be folks here tuned in that will be running their own win-loss interviews themselves. What's an example of like a bad question and an improved version that might get a lot more from the buyer themselves?
When we're working with our clients, what we often see is when we ask them what would they like to learn in their win-loss interviews, often you get questions which aren't actually the questions you should ask, but they're the questions you want answered, which can be different things. So, of course, you want to understand why they chose you or did not choose you, or you want to understand if if they liked the new pricing model that they just rolled out. But if you ask a narrow question, you're pigeonholing them, and you're not giving them. You might lose out on some more detail that you couldn't have gotten. So, for example, I just like to start off with broad questions, which would start with, what was going on that led you to look for a new solution? Very broad. Tell me what is going on, versus diving right in and saying, what was it about vendor A's solution that you liked the least?
What's the balance there though too? Because I think you have sort of as you mentioned, working with the clients, like research objectives that you're looking to accomplish and uncover. But there is this balance, right, between being very direct there or being broad. Like, how do you keep that openness so that they're telling a story but not losing the thread or the direction of where you want to go on the interview? Like, what are some of the things you do to kind of keep things on track?
Well, we have our discussion guides, of course, that helps structure our conversations. We always keep that in front of us. And I also know where we're going in terms of the interview. We're following the buyer's journey. So there's a natural progression. You start with, what was the problems you were trying to solve? What was the triggers or drivers for this evaluation? And then you naturally follow that to, well, what were you looking for? Who did you look for? How did you find who you were looking for? And that progressed to, well, then there was the evaluation. Hey, who came out on top and why? Were there any barriers to choosing them? So it follows a natural progression. But in terms of also keeping things tight, when I said earlier about having really nice and short and focused questions, but that are open, any question that really focuses on impact is helpful. Ask yourself, what is the impact of something, rather than driving them down towards a specific. So another big question I'd like is, instead of something specific like, what did you think about pricing model B? I would say, what impact did price have, if any, on the decision? Because if it didn't have an impact, then you also know it's going to be a narrower story. And it might be interesting, but if it didn't have impact, it's not going to be helpful. I
like that subtle reframe. I want to take 2 steps back, because we just started to jump into like the interview process itself. For, again, listeners, folks that might be conducting some of their first win-loss interviews themselves in-house, could you walk us through some of the steps that someone can, like what someone should be doing to set themselves up for a successful interview before the interview even starts? What are some of the things they should be thinking about and doing to prepare to get the most out of this short amount of time you do have with a buyer?
I think in terms of preparation, one of the hardest parts is to start off the interview. So setting the stage, introducing yourself, and having the logistics taken care of, almost write out what you're going to say, because it sounds ridiculous, but it's easy to stumble at the beginning, which then undermines the confidence in the person you're speaking to. And you might forget to set the stage so they have an understanding of what you want to talk about and what their job is in this conversation. So knowing what you want to say will give you confidence to get started. And then I like to have like a mental map. You wanted to know, what are those few key points that are the anchors for your conversation, so that you don't get lost. You can always find your way back. If you start drifting away from your guide, it'll bring you back. Another thing I would do as a tip for someone who hasn't done this too much is, I like to know approximately how much time I should spend on my major sections. So through experience, I know halfway through the interview, if I haven't started talking about their evaluation of the different vendors, I know I have to get there, because I'm going to run out of time. So that way, I always know that I'm going to be able to hit all my key topics in the time that I have available.
Speaking of topics, do you have a personal favorite, like section or topic that you like to dig into in an interview? Like, what's your favorite part to get into in these conversations?
I have a soft spot for understanding the context. What were the triggers and drivers that led to the evaluation? Because that really sets you up to understand the current situation of the interviewee and what they were trying to change and drive towards. So that will give you a better understanding on how they looked at the the different vendors, and the decisions that they eventually made. And hopefully there is a strong connection between both.
That's interesting. When we talked to Dylan Durso from Autodesk recently too, he was mentioning how much he loves that as the program owner. That business driver and context piece up front provides so much. I think a lot of folks come in, like you mentioned off the hop, like, I want to do win-loss because I want to know why we're winning and we're losing. And that's sort of like often an entry point or the impetus for starting win-loss. But then as you start to get more comfortable with it, doing it more and starting to see the value of like really strong interviews, Dylan pointed towards that of like, what are the business drivers? What would the reasons for them even starting the evaluation process and where are they at right now? Gave so much context that he wasn't even thinking of when he first launched the win-loss program. So I find that interesting, as well as the interviewer, that's where you feel like you're really able to set the stage and get even more. Speaking about getting even more, I think one of the big things that I've heard around really successful win-loss interviews isn't just having a set question list, but being able to probe effectively. So do you have any suggestions on how to probe, how to dig a little bit deeper when you start to get a response from someone what are the triggers you're finding of like, this is a thread that we should pull on because I think there's going to be really insightful stuff?
Well, it depends on what came before in the conversation, but again, what I'm looking for is impact. If they say something like, and the feature A was really important to us, and they don't say more, that tells you you need to probe. And then you just simply ask, well, why was that important to you? Another thing I like to ask is to keep the story going forward. If they're doing the setup, you just ask, so what happened next? That way, that keeps them in the storytelling mode and makes it a little more conversational.
I like this. I'm going to make this about me, classic. But going into like journalism school and asking the right questions, I like even what you just did there of just sitting in that pause and letting them fill in the gap with that pause. And these like questions just allow them to keep kind of carrying on with their story. Because oftentimes I feel the moment you reply with an or okay, like it's almost like a subtle nod for them to stop their answer or hit the brakes. And sitting in that pause is one of the things that I've noticed really starts to get more and more and more. Like people will just fill in that space, that blank space a lot more.
Some people think by following up with a question like why is a little challenging. If you say, I didn't like them because of some of their features, then you just say, well, why? Some people think you can soften it by saying, well, why is that? Or how come? Or tell me more. Tell me more about that.
Let's get into, you mentioned off the hop there, like anchoring parts of your conversation. And like, these are the things I need to get to. But do you have an example or a story where an absolute bombshell was dropped in an interview that wasn't part of maybe what you'd set out to look for? It maybe wasn't part of these anchoring parts of the conversation, but this bombshell kind of comes out of the interview and you're like, I need to dig. Could you tell me a story or share an example of that and how you weave that into what you're already trying to do off the hop?
You discover something new that was, it's important because it impacted their decision or shaped the way they saw things. So actually, yesterday morning, I was doing an interview and the respondent was talking about the impact of these new AI first competitors in this space. And that pricked up my ears because he also positioned the market. He described our client as a legacy provider and these new up and coming and emerging competitors as the disruptors. Right there, that's very interesting. He's putting a value judgment. There's the legacy and the disruptors are AI first. And then, so I pursued and said, well, what's significant about these AI first disruptors? What's disruptive about them? And he then said that through AI technology, the companies that were based on AI rather than having AI tacked on it, were able to provide a faster and more seamless solution. And it provided, it increased their efficiency because it was a force multiplier. It made it so much easier for them to address their use cases because the AI technology can do that, can get them to where they want to go faster than a traditional piece of software. So that really caught my attention, and I took time to talk, like 5 minutes to talk about that.
And was that one of the biggest kind of takeaways at the end of the interview that you shared with kind of the client?
I think the interview was this morning, so it's hot off the press. I haven't even had a chance, but it will be. And I took notes to bring it up in their executive summary, because I think this might be an outlier, but this is going to be an important point. So again, sometimes what's interesting is not is because you're looking for an outlier that is hinting at something that you hadn't seen before. And I think this is going to be an important point. And then later on, the respondent said, you know what? If I were the client, I would be wary that these new disruptors are coming after them.
That's an incredible story, first of all. I appreciate you sharing that. And to your point as well, you mentioned that you're kind of touching on the executive summary, which is for listeners, like what you're sharing out to the executive team. Like, what have you discovered from these interviews? And what you mentioned there is something that we just talked with Valerie from Seismic, who you work with, is the ability to share something that your stakeholders didn't previously know. Like, that's the really juicy stuff. Like, when any time there's something that has been overlooked or hasn't been considered, that's the stuff that's gonna like perk someone's ears, especially executives. They don't want to hear the stuff that they already know. And so I think that's an incredible example where you pick up on something that, oh, this is different. This doesn't come from our previous interviews. This is something that I think is going to be incredibly valuable for our clients.
Let me add to that one of the benefits of doing this is that you're getting the verbatims right from the buyer's mouths, and that's more persuasive than sometimes an internal perspective, even if they're similar. But also the buyers will be focusing on benefits, and a lot of technology companies focus on the features. But here, the buyer was focusing on the benefits of AI technology. They cared less about the how and focused on the what they were getting, which was speed, time to value, and the ease of use. You know, they were a team of one, and what they were looking for was something that would let them scale with a team of one. And they saw this new technology helping them to do that.
The last question I had for you as well, again, lots of the listeners are probably taking this on themselves. As someone who has done thousands and thousands of win-loss interviews, what's one piece of advice you would give to someone listening right now who are running their own win-loss interviews to take them from beginner to advanced, or maybe there's a midpoint, but something they can do to improve from a base level interview to something that's going to be a little bit more impactful?
It always helps to establish rapport at the beginning of the call. I've experimented by not establishing rapport and establishing rapport because it takes time that you're losing in your interview. But in general, I feel like you get better responses because they put them at ease and they're already having a natural conversation. And then you just segue and continue your conversation. So before I speak to an interviewee, I always like to look at their LinkedIn profile. Where are they calling from? What's their background history? Is there a company or a personality that they're following that we can talk about? So making just a little connection at the beginning gets them relaxed.
I mean, this is like kind of like a sales 101 too, that rapport building, building that connection, because you are really asking them stuff that is intimate in nature. Like the good stuff is going to be pretty intimate, and like being able to, anything you can do to get closer to that unlock, whether it's structuring properly, whether it's probing properly, whether it's building rapport. I feel like a lot of the things when I'm listening to you talk is like setting yourselves up to get that unlock. You don't know what it might be, but as long as you can put yourself in that position, that's when you're going to get the good stuff.
I think really focusing on your key questions is important. But if you properly structure the first few questions, the conversation is going to naturally flow to capture everything you want. So you just need to know what are the few questions where you need to re-enter to nudge the conversation forward in any areas you hadn't discussed. So again, pick up your game, know what are the key points you want, and focus on hitting those first. And a lot of them would be, what was going on that led you to make the evaluation? Who did you look at and why? You'll get product feedback. Don't forget to talk about price, the impact of price. That's one that's easy to forget if it wasn't brought up. Sales feedback as well. So sometimes when you're new to this and you've got your script, you're so worried about the exact wording, and you won't need to ask all those questions. So focus more on the big points that you want covered, and that'll help you succeed.
Thank you so much, Andre. There was a ton in this conversation, both tactics, both strategy and how you should set up your conversation, questions to ask. I really appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And if anyone has any other questions, you can connect with Andre. LinkedIn, Andre Csapo, Csapo.
That's right.
Any win-loss interview questions you have, anything around that, he's one of the best in the biz. Thank you so much for joining me, and we'll catch everyone next week.